They said, "We don't need your money, Ruth," like it was a kindness, not a knife. I remember the way Emily smiled when she said it. Tight at the corners, polite enough for the children to hear, cruel enough for me to understand exactly what she meant. I had been holding the envelope all evening, waiting for the right moment to offer it. A simple birthday gift for my son and his wife. Something to help with their new house, their future. $50,000 I'd saved through years of careful living, cutting corners, skipping vacations, keeping a garden instead of buying vegetables. I thought they would be grateful, maybe even touched. Instead, Emily placed her manicured hand on top of mine, her nails cold and smooth as glass, and pushed the envelope back toward me. "We're fine, really." "We don't need your money?" And everyone at the table laughed softly, as if it were some gentle misunderstanding, a sweet mistake of an old woman who didn't know where she belonged. I laughed too, because that's what you do when humiliation dresses itself up as good manners. I'm 78 now. I live alone in the same small brick house my husband and I bought in 1974. The one with the creaky porch and the lilac bushes that bloom too early every year. Walter's been gone for 12 springs. His tools still hang in the garage where he left them, and sometimes when I pass by, I pretend I hear the clink of his wrench against the workbench, the little whistle he used to make when he was thinking. People tell me I should sell the house. It's too big, too drafty, but I can't. It's the only place where I'm not invisible. The neighborhood has changed. Younger couples with big dogs and bigger cars. Children who call me Miss Ruth because their parents taught them the word Mrs. means old. I used to bake cookies for the new families, but they stopped coming to the door. Now I just wave from my porch and water the plants no one else notices. That night, after Emily's comment, I went home and placed the torn envelope on the kitchen counter. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock above the stove. I made tea I didn't drink. The check lay between the sugar bowl and my hands, uncashed, unwanted, a symbol of something larger, of how easily people can erase the hands that once held them upright. I thought about all the times I had said yes without being asked. When Paul needed help with college, when Emily wanted new furniture before the baby came, when the roof on their first house leaked and I paid the contractor myself. Back then, my money was useful. Back then, I had purpose. Now, apparently, my generosity had expired, just like the milk I'd forgotten in the fridge. The next morning, Paul called. His voice was cheerful, too bright. He said, "Mom, don't take last night the wrong way. Emily just doesn't like feeling dependent, you know." I said I understood, and I did, in a way. Dependency is a mirror people avoid because it shows them who they once were. He said, "You know we love you." I told him I knew. We said goodbye like strangers who still owe each other politeness. When I hung up, the silence filled the room so thickly I could almost touch it. In the days that followed, I noticed small things I'd never paid attention to before. The framed family photo that used to sit on my mantel, Paul holding his first baby, me smiling beside him, had been replaced by a landscape painting of some generic meadow. I'd done it myself months earlier after Emily said the photo clashed with the living room palette. I hadn't realized what that gesture really meant until now. It was the beginning of erasure, quiet and tasteful, wrapped in good taste. The phone stopped ringing except for telemarketers. Sundays stretched wide and silent. I started talking to the radio just to hear my own voice bounce back. But the mind has its own rebellion. One evening, sorting through old letters, I found a postcard from Evelyn, a friend I hadn't seen in years. We'd worked together at the library back when people still came there for company. The card was simple. An image of a small coastal town, blue water, gulls suspended over white roofs. She'd written, "There's a woman here, Rosa. Reminds me of you when you were young. Fierce, proud, working 2 jobs, raising a sick child. Wish you could meet her." I read that line over and over until the words blurred. There was something in the way Evelyn wrote, "Reminds me of you." Not pity, but recognition. It stirred something restless inside me, something I hadn't felt since Walter died. The sense that I could still make a difference, not just endure quietly until the days ran out. That night, I dreamed of my garden in spring, the peonies opening like small hearts, the soil damp and forgiving beneath my hands. I woke up before dawn and sat by the window, the torn envelope still on the counter beside the teapot. I thought of Emily's voice, "We don't need your money." Perhaps she was right. Perhaps they didn't. But someone did. Someone always does. And maybe the true insult wasn't that they refused the gift, but that they decided they could define the worth of what I had to give. I began to make lists the next day, small and secretive, not of bills or groceries, but of what remained mine, what was still within my power. A savings account with more than I'd ever admit, the car I could still drive, the stories no one remembered but me. I packed a small suitcase, not because I planned to leave that very minute, but because I wanted to feel the weight of my own readiness. I folded a dress Walter had always liked, slipped a few photographs into the side pocket, and tucked the torn halves of the check into my wallet as a reminder. I wasn't sure where I would go yet, only that staying where I was felt like agreeing to disappear. When people talk about betrayal, they imagine shouting, slammed doors, dramatic exits. But real betrayal is quieter. That's the part they never tell you. How cruelty, when dressed well, can pass for civility. The night before I left, I stood in the doorway of my bedroom and looked at everything I owned. It wasn't much. A few pieces of furniture, photographs in old frames, Walter's watch still ticking faintly though the glass was cracked. I whispered to him, as I sometimes still do, telling him I was sorry for being slow to learn that love doesn't always mean belonging. Then I turned off the lights and went to bed. In the darkness, the words returned again, steady and almost comforting now. "We don't need your money." Fine, I thought. Then I'll find someone who does. It happened on a Sunday that felt borrowed from another life. One of those afternoons when the light drifts lazily through the curtains and everything seems fragile and temporary, even the air. Paul and Emily had invited me for lunch, a small family gathering, they said, casual, nothing fancy. I baked a lemon pound cake, wrapped it in foil, and took the bus because my car had begun making a strange noise, and I didn't want to bother anyone to pick me up. When I arrived, the table was already set, the wine open, the air scented faintly with garlic and rosemary. Emily greeted me with her practiced warmth, a kind of professional politeness that made me feel like a guest in a rental home. The children were upstairs playing. Paul was adjusting the thermostat, and I stood in the hallway holding my cake like a peace offering from another century. During lunch, conversation hovered around renovations, new appliances, and the upcoming vacation to Italy. They talked about business-class seats, the villa with a pool, the way Europeans take time to rest properly. I smiled, nodding in the right places, pretending that I was part of it even though I knew I wouldn't be asked to join. When I mentioned that I had once dreamed of visiting Florence because I'd studied a bit of art history in my youth, Emily gave a distracted smile and said, Oh, it's lovely, but so crowded. You probably wouldn't enjoy the walking. There it was again, that small dismissal disguised as concern. I said nothing and kept cutting my chicken, the sound of the knife against the plate filling the silence that followed. When we finished, Paul poured coffee, and the children came downstairs to pick at the cake. I waited for a moment that felt right, a soft gap in the chatter. And then I said, as gently as I could, "I've been thinking about something. I'd like to help you both with the new house. It's a lot of money, and I know starting over isn't easy. I could give you $50,000. No strings, just a gift." I thought I saw relief flicker across Paul's face for a fraction of a second, but Emily's hand landed on his arm before he could speak. She smiled that same impeccable smile, the one that hides steel behind porcelain. "Ruth, that's incredibly generous," she said, "but truly, we don't need your money." The words dropped like ice cubes into hot water. Everyone froze, even the children, though they didn't understand why. I tried to smile, to make it lighter. "It's not about need, dear. It's about family." Emily's tone sharpened just enough to draw blood. "You've done plenty already. We're trying to be independent." She said the word like a verdict, and I felt the temperature in the room shift. Paul cleared his throat, mumbled something about gratitude, but it was too late. The moment had turned to ash. I reached for my coffee, my hand steady though my chest was trembling, and said, "Of course I understand." And I did, in a terrible way. I understood that my place in their life had quietly expired. The rest of the afternoon unfolded like a play I hadn't rehearsed for. They talked about flights and school schedules, while I sat smiling, nodding, invisible. When I stood to leave, Emily hugged me with her perfume still sharp from the morning, and Paul kissed my cheek, quick and dutiful. I carried the empty cake tin in my bag like a secret. Outside, the wind had picked up. The street was full of blossoms swirling along the pavement, little ghosts of spring that didn't know where to land. On the bus ride home, I replayed the conversation again and again, as if rearranging the words could change what they meant. Maybe I had overstepped. Maybe it was pride, not cruelty. But pride, I realized, is just fear dressed up in expensive clothes. It fears debt, gratitude, the reminder that we once needed someone else. I looked out the window at the passing houses, the lawns trimmed too neat, the empty porches, and I thought of how quickly love becomes something to manage, like clutter in a hallway. Tidy it, label it, hide it away. When I reached home, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with the envelope I'd never had the chance to open. I tore it in half, then in half again, the paper soft against my fingers. The sound was quieter than I expected. I watched the pieces fall into the trash and felt neither regret nor victory, only a strange clarity, like seeing the bottom of a pond after the mud settles. For years, I had mistaken giving for being needed. I had poured myself into other people's lives as if love could be measured in favors and checks and casseroles. Now, sitting there under the weak light of the kitchen, I realized that what I'd called generosity had been fear of being forgotten. The following week, Paul called to say, "Thank you for coming," his voice brisk, distracted. He said Emily appreciated the cake. I could hear her in the background, her tone sharp as glass. "Tell her we'll call her next week," she said. He didn't. No one did. The silence stretched, elastic, until it felt like another wall between us. I filled my days with errands I didn't need to run, visited shops where no one knew my name, bought a new notebook just to have something blank. One afternoon, I found myself at the bank, almost without planning it. I asked to see my account details, the ones I hadn't touched in years except for birthdays and taxes. The teller, a young man with soft eyes and a badge that read Elias, smiled at me as though I were someone's grandmother, which I suppose I am, though I felt more like a ghost. "Would you like to make a withdrawal?" he asked. I said yes, but I wasn't sure yet for what. I just needed to feel the weight of choice in my hands again. He placed the stack of bills in a crisp white envelope and slid it toward me. It felt heavier than $50,000. It felt like the beginning of something that might finally belong to me. That night, I placed the envelope on the dresser beside Walter's photo. He looked at me from behind the glass, his eyes the same warm gray they had always been, full of quiet questions. "What would you have done?" I asked him. The photograph said nothing, of course, but I imagined he would have smiled that slow, steady smile of his and said, "Do what you need to, Ruth. They've already told you who they are. Now it's time to remember who you are." I left the envelope there until morning, when the sun slid through the blinds and fell across it like a spotlight. And that's when I knew. The betrayal wasn't that they rejected my money. It was that they reduced it, and me, to a transaction, a threat to their illusion of independence. They had rewritten love into something conditional, efficient, marketable. But I still had something they couldn't measure, something they had never bothered to understand: the quiet, stubborn will of a woman who has nothing left to lose and still chooses to give. So I took the envelope, folded it neatly, and placed it inside my handbag. I didn't know where it would end up yet, but I knew it wouldn't go back to them. That, I decided, would be the first decision in a very long time that was mine alone. The days after that Sunday stretched long and empty, like fabric pulled too tight. I found myself moving slower around the house, not because of age, but because silence had weight now. There was no one to talk to except the clock and the radio, and even the radio sounded like it pitied me. I kept the envelope hidden in the bottom drawer beneath old birthday cards and Walter's reading glasses, as though secrecy could protect it from the meaning it had already taken on. I didn't tell anyone I still had the money. I didn't tell Paul, and certainly not Emily. Some part of me liked the thought that they assumed I'd done nothing, that I'd folded under their polite dismissal like paper under rain. It made me feel private again, and in a life that had been public property for decades, privacy felt like power. I started going out more, aimlessly at first. The grocery store, the park, the post office. I liked standing in lines where no one knew me, where I could listen to the chatter of strangers and imagine belonging to a different kind of family, one that asked questions because they cared, not because they wanted control. Once, while waiting for my change at the bakery, the young man behind the counter smiled and said, "You remind me of my grandmother. She used to bake the best apple pie." It was such a simple thing, but it caught me off guard. For the rest of the day, I thought about that pie, about hands that had kneaded dough and wiped away tears and still somehow found strength to give sweetness. It reminded me that maybe, in small, forgotten corners of the world, goodness still existed. At home, I began sorting through drawers and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. Letters, photographs, receipts from trips long past. I found a picture of Paul as a boy, no older than 7, standing in front of the old oak tree with a slingshot in one hand and mud up to his knees. I remembered how he used to run to me after every small success, face bright with triumph, shouting, "Look what I did, Mom." That same boy had grown into a man who looked at me now as if I were a piece of furniture that no longer matched the decor. The thought hurt, but it also hardened something inside me. I stopped trying to defend what I meant to him. You can't argue someone into seeing you. They either do or they don't. Around that time, Evelyn called. I hadn't heard her voice in nearly a decade, yet it slipped through the line like a memory I'd been waiting for. "Ruth," she said, "I got your Christmas card last year. Took you long enough to write, old friend." We talked for over an hour about nothing and everything. Gardens, husbands gone, the strangeness of surviving everyone you love. When she mentioned Rosa again, the young woman she'd written about, I felt the stir of something between guilt and curiosity. Evelyn said Rosa worked double shifts at the nursing home, that she was raising her son alone, a little boy who couldn't walk, but drew pictures of airplanes and said he'd fly one someday. "She's proud," Evelyn said. "Too proud to ask for help. Reminds you always did show up where you were needed." The idea stayed with me like a seed caught in my sleeve. The next morning, I looked up the bus routes to Evelyn's town, a small coastal place called Mapleford, 2 hours away. I told no one. I packed a small bag, change of clothes, my medicine, a notebook, the envelope. When the day came, I stood in front of the mirror and almost didn't recognize myself. The woman staring back wasn't fragile. She was calm, deliberate, even elegant in her old wool coat. I locked the door behind me and left without leaving a note. The bus was nearly empty. I sat by the window, watching the world unspool in slow motion. Gas stations, children in bright coats, fields yellowing into winter. I thought of Emily and Paul at their polished dining table, sipping imported coffee, certain that I was at home knitting or watching television. They didn't know that I was already gone in ways they could never measure. Somewhere along that stretch of highway, I stopped being the woman who waited for permission to exist. When I arrived in Mapleford, Evelyn met me at the station with a paper cup of coffee and that same mischievous smile she'd always had. Her hair was all silver now, tied back with a ribbon that didn't match her coat. "You look good," she said. "Better than when you were trying to save everyone." We laughed. Two old women standing on cracked pavement, free of pretense. She drove me through narrow streets lined with bare trees until we reached her modest little house by the water. Inside, everything smelled of cinnamon and books. "You'll meet Rosa tomorrow," she said. "She's shy, but kind. Don't scare her with your big city manners." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the small guest room listening to the waves outside and the wind scraping against the window. The envelope sat on the nightstand, pale and silent. I thought about what it meant to give something without expecting return. Not to fix a problem, not to buy affection, but simply to acknowledge another person's struggle as if it were your own. Maybe that was the real inheritance I wanted to leave behind. Not the money itself, but the act of seeing someone fully, the way I had longed to be seen. In the early hours before dawn, I made myself a promise. I would get the thought soothed me. I felt lighter, almost young, as if the air had forgiven me for something. The next day, Evelyn took me to the nursing home where Rosa worked. It was an old brick building with ivy climbing up its sides and the faint smell of disinfectant in the air. I watched from the car as a slim young woman in scrubs helped an old man into a wheelchair, her hands steady, her face patient. When she smiled, it wasn't bright or practiced like Emily's. It was tired, but genuine, the kind of smile that comes from knowing exhaustion and choosing kindness anyway. I knew in that instant that I'd come to the right place. That evening, back at Evelyn's house, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. The bills looked almost absurdly neat, stacked and perfect. I thought of Emily's laughter, Paul's silence, the way they'd reduced me to an inconvenience wrapped in politeness. I thought of the boy who dreamed of flying and the woman who carried him through every storm. I wrote a note, just one line. From one mother to another, for whatever makes tomorrow easier. Then I sealed it with tape, and when I pressed my fingers to the paper, I felt not loss, but completion, like closing a circle that had stayed open too long. When I met Rosa, I didn't expect her to look so young. She couldn't have been more than 30, with eyes that carried both fatigue and a quiet stubbornness. Her hair was pulled into a loose braid, strands escaping near her temples like she didn't have time to care about appearances. She greeted me politely when Evelyn introduced us, her voice steady but guarded, as if she'd learned the hard way that kindness often came with conditions. We sat in the little break room of the nursing home, the air thick with the scent of bleach and overboiled coffee. She spoke softly about her son, Mateo, how he loved airplanes, how the doctors said he might never walk, but he still insisted on drawing runways on the back of old receipts. I listened more than I talked. For years, I had been the one filling silences, explaining myself, apologizing for existing. Now, I simply let her words move through the space between us like a tide. When she asked what had brought me to Mapleford, I hesitated. The truth was too heavy for small talk, so I told her the gentlest version, that I had come to visit an old friend, that I wanted to see the ocean again before winter set in, that I'd been thinking about how people lose their way in love and find it again in strangers. She nodded slowly, as if she understood anyway. It was Evelyn who finally broke the tension by handing her the envelope. "From Ruth," she said. No explanation needed. Rosa stared at it, confused, then back at me. "I can't take this," she whispered. "Please don't make me." I smiled, not out of triumph, but relief. "You're not taking it," I said. "You're continuing it." She didn't understand at first, so I explained. "Once someone gave me a life I didn't deserve. My husband, my parents, even my son, before he forgot who I was. This is me keeping the chain unbroken." She tried to refuse again, her hands trembling slightly, but I placed the envelope on the table between us, firm as a boundary. "Don't thank me," I said. "Just use it for whatever helps, for whatever gives you a little room to breathe." Her eyes filled with tears she didn't want to shed, and I looked away to give her the dignity of privacy. I remembered all the times I'd cried quietly in kitchens, bathrooms, parking lots, tears meant for no one but myself. That's what survival looks like, I thought. Not strength, just the decision to keep standing when sitting would be easier. When I left the nursing home that afternoon, the air smelled faintly of salt from the nearby shore. Evelyn didn't say anything as we walked to the car. She didn't need to. Something had shifted in me, and she could feel it. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about Paul or Emily or what they might say if they found out. I wasn't rehearsing explanations. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was simply full of air, of light, of something that felt almost like forgiveness, but wasn't quite that gentle. It was recognition. I saw myself clearly, not as the woman waiting to be appreciated, but as the woman who finally decided she didn't need an audience. That evening, I sat with Evelyn in her small kitchen overlooking the bay. We shared soup and bread, simple food that tasted like memory, She poured us each a little wine and said, "You look different." I laughed. "Lighter?" "Alive," she corrected. "Like someone opened a window in you." I nodded, staring out at the darkening sky. Maybe I forgot it was locked all this time. We stayed up late, two old friends talking about the past not as something lost, but as something survived. When she went to bed, I stayed behind, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant rhythm of waves. It was then I realized that the act of giving had taken something heavy out of me. Not money, not memory, but the weight of waiting. For years, I had waited for gratitude, for love to be reflected back in the faces of those I'd raised, for someone to say, "You did enough." But that sentence never comes. No one ever tells you when your work as a mother is complete. You just reach a point when you're no longer needed, and if you're lucky, you learn that being unneeded can also mean being free. The next morning, I walked down to the pier. The sky was pale blue, thin and tender, like old porcelain. Fishermen were setting up their nets, gulls circling overhead. I sat at the edge of the dock, feeling the wood creak beneath me, and thought of Matteo drawing airplanes on scraps of paper. The image of him, small, determined, defying gravity in his own way, felt like a quiet answer to the question I hadn't realized I'd been asking. What happens after you've been erased? You find another canvas. You start again. You give shape to something new. I didn't stay long in Mapleford. A few days later, I hugged Evelyn goodbye at the bus station. She pressed my hand and said, "Whatever you do, don't go back to shrinking yourself." I promised I wouldn't, though promises at my age are more poetry than contract. On the ride home, I felt an unfamiliar calm settle inside me. Not joy exactly, but steadiness. I looked out the window at the long stretch of highway, the same road I'd traveled before, but everything looked different now. Not because the world had changed, but because I finally had. When I reached home, the house greeted me like an old friend. Dusty, quiet, faithful. I put on the kettle, the same one Walter had bought me for our 10th anniversary, and waited for it to whistle. On the kitchen table lay a pile of unopened mail, bills, catalogs, reminders of the life I'd left on pause. I sifted through them slowly until one envelope caught my eye, Paul's handwriting. For a moment, I considered not opening it. Then I did. It was short, cautious, almost embarrassed. Just checking in. "Hope you're well. Emily says hello." I smiled, folded it neatly, and placed it under the teapot to keep it from flying away in the draft. There was no bitterness left, only the strange peace that comes when you finally stop chasing love that doesn't know your shape anymore. That night, I stood by the window, the lights from the street stretching long across the glass. I could still see the faint reflection of my face, softer than before, as if time itself had decided to be kind for once. I whispered to it, not in prayer, but in recognition. You did it. You gave. And you lived. Then I turned off the lamp and went to bed, certain for the first time in years that whatever waited beyond the horizon was mine to walk toward. It was 3 weeks before the quiet began to sound different, not empty anymore, but expectant, like the pause before a song begins. I had grown used to my own company, the rhythm of small days that belonged to no one else. I swept the kitchen floor every morning, watered the plants that still clung to life on the windowsill, and walked to the corner store for milk just to exchange a few words with the clerk, who always called me ma'am, in a tone that was neither pity nor indifference. I had started to sleep better, too, though the nights were long and the house creaked like it remembered everything I had forgotten. I thought maybe this was what peace looked like. Modest, undemanding, a life that asked nothing but presence. Then one afternoon the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. The sound startled me after so many days of silence. It was Paul. His voice was tight, practiced, the kind he used when he was trying not to sound angry. "Mom," he said, "we heard from Evelyn. She mentioned you were in Mapleford. What were you doing there?" I could picture Emily standing beside him, arms crossed, mouthing the words she wanted him to say. I told him the truth, or most of it, that I had visited an old friend, that I'd needed a change of air. He hesitated. "Did you give someone money?" The question was sharp enough to cut through the line. I didn't answer right away. "Why would that matter?" I asked. He sighed, the way he used to as a teenager when I told him to clean his room. "It matters because we worry. You can't just hand over large sums to strangers. You could be taken advantage of." I felt my lips curve into a small smile that he couldn't see. "You're worried about my money now. I thought you didn't need it." He started to say something, but Emily must have taken the phone because her voice came next. Bright, brittle, coated with sugar. "Ruth, we're just concerned. People can be manipulative, especially when they see someone your age alone. It's not safe to be so trusting." I let her talk, her words flowing like cold water over stone. When she paused for breath, I said quietly, "The only people who ever manipulated me were the ones who smiled while they did it." There was a silence so dense I could almost hear her blinking. "We'll come by next weekend," she said finally, her voice thinner. "We need to make sure everything's in order." I told her that wouldn't be necessary. "I'm fine, Emily. I have everything I need." Then I hung up before she could answer. Afterward, I stood by the window watching the sky turn the color of bruised fruit. I felt no guilt, no triumph, only certainty. They would come anyway, I knew. Control wears many masks, and concern is one of its most convincing disguises. Still, I wasn't afraid. They no longer had the language to reach me. I had learned a new one made of silence and small defiances, of keeping what was mine and giving what they could never understand. When the weekend came, the knock on the door was polite, rhythmic, rehearsed. I opened it to find Emily holding a bouquet of white lilies and Paul standing slightly behind her, hands buried in his pockets. "We brought flowers," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The lilies smelled clean and sterile, like hospital rooms. Paul kissed my cheek, awkwardly, then looked around as if cataloging the state of my home. "You've redecorated," he said. I hadn't. Things were simply arranged differently now, less for show, more for comfort. Emily placed the flowers on the table and said, "We've been so worried. You haven't been answering calls." "I didn't realize there was a test I'd failed," I said. They exchanged a glance, the kind married people use when they're about to perform a familiar scene. Emily began again, her tone careful. "Ruth, we think it might be a good idea if we helped you manage some of your finances. It's just—" She hesitated, pretending to search for the word. "Simpler? You know, for everyone." I sat down slowly, folding my hands in my lap. "Simpler for whom?" She smiled, thin and patient. "For you. We could set up automatic transfers, make sure no one takes advantage of you." I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Emily, you've mistaken me for someone who needs saving. Paul shifted uncomfortably. Mom, we're just trying to protect you. I met his eyes and saw the same boy who used to cry when he broke something, desperate to fix it before I noticed. I'm not broken, I said, and protection isn't love when it comes with strings. They stayed for tea, though no one drank much. Emily kept glancing around, her gaze landing briefly on the small framed photo of me and Evelyn by the pier. She asked about the woman in the picture, her tone too casual. I told her we'd gone to school together. You've always been generous, she said, as if testing the air. Sometimes too generous. Generosity only becomes too much when it's given to the wrong people, I replied. That ended the conversation. After they left, the house felt lighter again, as if it had been holding its breath. I sat on the couch for a long time, thinking about what they'd said, about how quickly worry turns to accusation when money is involved. It wasn't really about the $50,000. It was about ownership. The need to believe that I was still orbiting their world, still available to serve the narrative of the grateful old mother. But that story had ended the moment Emily said those words. We don't need your money. They just hadn't realized it yet. A few days later, a letter arrived. Thick paper, expensive stationery. I didn't need to open it to know it was from a lawyer. The language inside was as polite as it was poisonous. Phrases like concern for your well-being and joint financial oversight and protective measures. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and slid it into the drawer with the torn halves of the original check. Then I called a lawyer of my own, a woman named Harriet, recommended by a neighbor who once helped her with her mother's estate. Harriet's voice was brisk and kind. When I explained the situation, she said, "So, you'd like to make your independence legally clear?" "Exactly," I said. "I don't want protection. I want boundaries." She laughed softly. "I think you've already drawn them, Ruth. I'll just make them official." That night, I wrote a letter to Paul by hand, the way I used to when he was in college and refused to call. I told him that I loved him, that love hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape. I told him I was proud of the man he'd become, even if that man could no longer see me clearly. And I told him I didn't need his approval to live quietly or to give as I saw fit. I didn't mention Rosa or the money. Some truths are too sacred to be defended. When I finished, I signed my name slowly, pressing the pen hard enough to leave an imprint on the paper beneath. The following morning, I walked to the post office and mailed both letters, mine to Paul and Harriet's response to the lawyer who represented him. It felt ceremonial, almost holy. The woman at the counter asked if I wanted tracking. "No," I said. "If they're meant to arrive, they will." When I stepped back into the sunlight, I realized I was smiling. The air felt crisp, alive, like it carried my breath a little further than before. For a while after that, nothing happened. Or maybe things were happening quietly, just beyond sight, the way grass grows when you aren't looking. I began volunteering a few hours a week at the local library, shelving books, answering questions about old maps, and poetry. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like returning to myself. One afternoon, while dusting a shelf near the window, I saw Rosa walk in, holding Mateo's small hand. She'd come all the way from Mapleford to visit a specialist in town. When she saw me, her face lit up in surprise and something softer, gratitude that didn't need words. She introduced me to her son, and when he smiled shyly, I saw that his drawing of airplanes wasn't fantasy anymore. It was faith in motion. I realized then that my gift had traveled further than money ever could. That evening, as I walked home, the streetlights flickered on one by one, and the world seemed tender again, imperfect and forgiving. I thought of Walter, of Evelyn, of Rosa and Matteo, and even of Paul and Emily, caught in their polished cage of appearances. I didn't hate them. I simply understood them now. Fear makes people cruel, and pride makes them blind. Maybe, in some other life, they'd learn what I had, that love doesn't live in possession, but in release. When I reached my porch, the air was cool, and a stray cat darted across the yard. I stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of my own breath, steady and calm. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a visitor in my own story. I was home, not in a house, but in myself. The letter from the lawyer should have been the end of it, but endings rarely arrive when you expect them. A week later, there was a knock at my door, sharp and hurried, the kind that carries both anger and urgency. I knew before I opened it. Emily stood there first, her expression perfectly composed, but her eyes bright with something brittle, and Paul hovered behind her, pale and silent. She didn't wait for an invitation this time. "We need to talk," she said, and brushed past me into the living room as if it still belonged to her idea of me. The lilies she had brought on her last visit had long since wilted, their stems still sitting in cloudy water. She noticed and frowned, as though the decay were an accusation. "You could have called," I said. She ignored that. "Why are you doing this to us?" Her voice trembled at the edges. "We're your family. You can't just cut us out of decisions." I wanted to ask what decision she meant, the decision to live, to breathe, to think, but I only said, "I'm not cutting anyone out. I'm simply living my life as if it were mine." Paul stepped forward then, his tone softer, pleading. "Mom, we love you. We just want to make sure you're safe. There are people who could trick you. That woman, Rosa, she could have taken advantage." "Stop," I said, and the word came out so firmly that even I was startled. "You think kindness is naivety because you've forgotten what it looks like. She didn't take anything from me. I gave it freely." "That's what you never understood." Emily's face twisted slightly, something between frustration and disbelief. "Do you realize what you've done? You've thrown away our inheritance." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the truth of it was so small compared to what she thought it meant. "Inheritance?" I said quietly. "You can't inherit what was never promised. My money was never yours to expect." She turned to Paul for support, but he said nothing. He was staring at the floor, jaw tight, a man caught between the comfort of obedience and the shame of realizing its cost. I felt sorry for him, not as a son, but as a human being who had traded his own voice for peace in his household. We stood like that for a while, the three of us surrounded by the ghosts of everything unsaid. The afternoon light slanted through the window, falling across the photograph of Walter on the shelf. I looked at it, and it felt like he was watching, quiet and steady as always. That gave me strength. I walked to the writing desk, opened the drawer, and took out a folder I had prepared days ago. Inside were the legal papers Harriet had drawn up, the will, the signed statement of independence, the transfer of a portion of my savings to a foundation for caregivers in small towns, the same one Rosa's workplace had recommended. I placed the folder on the table and said, "Everything's been arranged." You don't need to worry about me or my money. When the time comes, what's left will go where it can still do some good." Emily's face drained of color. "You've given it away?" "No," I said. "I've given it meaning." She opened her mouth to protest, but Paul touched her arm lightly, the gesture of someone too tired to fight. "Emily, stop," he murmured. "She's made up her mind." She turned on him then, sharp as a blade. "She's not thinking clearly." "Yes, she is," he said quietly, and for the first time in years, I heard his voice as his own. She gathered her purse, her fury now disguised as composure. "This is a mistake," she said at the door. "One day you'll regret it." "Maybe," I said, "but regret belongs to those who never act." When the door closed behind them, the silence that followed was deep and kind. I sat down in the chair by the window, my heart steady, but my hands trembling slightly from the weight of what had just passed. I thought I might cry, but no tears came, only a strange lightness, as if some long knot inside me had finally loosened. The next morning, I went into the garden. The peonies were starting to fade, their petals soft and bruised at the edges, and the air carried that faint sweetness of endings. I knelt to pull out a weed and found myself laughing softly at the absurdity of it all. That after 78 years, after everything I had endured and given and lost, my great act of defiance would look to the world like an old woman tending her flowers. But I knew better. I had drawn a line, not with anger but with clarity, and I had kept my dignity intact. That was the inheritance I wanted to leave behind. A few days later, a letter arrived from Rosa. It was written on simple stationery, the kind sold in discount stores, and the handwriting was round and careful. She thanked me, though she didn't use the word thank exactly. She wrote, "I didn't know people like you still existed. The money helped with Mateo's therapy, but what helped more was remembering that someone saw us. I hope you're well." Tucked inside was a drawing. Mateo had drawn 2 airplanes, one large and one small, flying side by side above a crooked line of clouds. At the bottom, in shaky letters, he had written, "Thank you, Miss Ruth." I sat at the kitchen table with that drawing spread before me, and for a long time I didn't move. I didn't need to. The whole world seemed to have folded itself into that piece of paper. Later that evening, Paul called. His voice was softer than I'd ever heard it, stripped of performance. "Mom," he said, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry." I closed my eyes, listening. "For what?" I asked. "For letting her speak for me," he said. "For not standing up. For forgetting who you are." I felt something warm rise in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but a tenderness I hadn't expected. "You remembered now," I said. "That's enough." We didn't talk long. There was nothing left to explain. When I hung up, I felt no triumph, no vindication, only the quiet certainty that life had given me one last chance to set its record straight. That night, I wrote another letter, this one to Rosa. I told her I'd received Mateo's drawing and that it would stay on my wall until the day I couldn't see it anymore. I told her that people like her reminded people like me that goodness isn't gone. It's just quieter than greed. I didn't mention my family. They were no longer the center of the story. I sealed the envelope and placed it beside the vase of fading lilies. Then I turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the doorway, listening to the house breathe. It sounded alive again. as if it had forgiven me for all the years I had filled it with worry. When I finally went to bed, I left the window open. The night air carried the scent of rain and lilac. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled, gentle, approving, like the earth itself sighing with relief. I thought of Walter, of the woman I used to be, and of the one I had become. I whispered into the darkness. They said they didn't need my money, and they were right. They never did. I was the one who needed to give it away, to find myself again in the giving. And with that thought, I fell asleep, unafraid of the next morning. Morning comes gently now. I wake before the alarm, before the street begins to stir, and for a few quiet minutes, the world feels like it belongs only to me. The light moves slowly across the ceiling, pale and forgiving, and I listen to the birds outside the window arguing softly about nothing. My hands ache, as they always do, but I no longer see that as a burden. Pain is simply the body remembering that it's still here. I make tea the same way I have for decades, but now I drink it without distraction, without the need to fill the silence. The house feels different these days, not because it has changed, but because I have stopped measuring its emptiness against what used to fill it. The walls don't echo anymore. They hum quietly, like an old friend whispering that solitude isn't the same as loneliness. Sometimes I walk to the park near the river, the one where families gather on weekends. Children run past me with the easy laughter of people who haven't yet learned to hide joy. I sit on the same bench every time, near the willow tree, and watch the world unfold. No one knows who I am, and that anonymity feels like a luxury. I used to crave recognition, to be seen, to be thanked. But now I find comfort in being unnoticed. There is power in quietness, in not explaining yourself anymore. When people pass by, I smile. Some smile back, most don't, and it doesn't matter either way. Every few weeks, I receive a letter from Rosa. She writes about Mateo's progress, how he has started walking short distances with help, how he still draws airplanes and now adds birds flying alongside them. She sends photos too, grainy, printed on cheap paper, but full of life. The last one showed Mateo holding a model plane above his head, his face lit with determination. I pinned it to the refrigerator next to an old picture of Paul as a boy. I look at them both sometimes, not to compare but to remind myself that love can take many shapes, and not all of them are meant to return to us. Love that travels outward still belongs to us, even when it doesn't circle back. I haven't heard from Emily in months, and I no longer expect to. Paul calls occasionally, his voice gentler now, stripped of the tension that once knotted every word. We speak of simple things, the garden, his children, the weather. There's a fragile honesty in those conversations, the kind that grows only after everything else has fallen away. He never mentions the money or the past, and neither do I. Some truths are best left as quiet understandings rather than reopened wounds. I know he loves me in his own hesitant way, and I've learned that love doesn't need to be loud to be real. One afternoon, while watering the lilacs, I found myself thinking of all the women I've known, neighbors, co-workers, friends long gone, women who lived their lives in the narrow space between giving and being erased. I wished I could gather them all here, sit them at this kitchen table, pour tea, and tell them what I finally understand. That it's possible to be generous without disappearing, that kindness doesn't mean surrender, and that sometimes the most radical act a woman can perform is to decide that her story still belongs to her, no matter who stopped listening. If I could speak to them, I'd say, "You are not what they took from you. You are what you chose to keep." As the seasons turn, the garden changes color. I spend my mornings tending to it, moving slowly but with purpose. The peonies I planted decades ago still bloom each year, stubbornly beautiful, even when late frost threatens them. They remind me that endurance can be quiet too, that not all strength is loud or sharp. When I trim the dead leaves, I think of Walter and how he used to tell me that plants know when they're loved. I think of Evelyn and Rosa and the strange, invisible thread that connects women who have decided to live honestly after being told to fade away. Sometimes in the evening, when the sun slides low and paints the room in gold, I take out Mateo's drawing, the two airplanes, the crooked clouds, and place it on the table. It's wrinkled now, a little torn at the edges, but when I look at it, I feel something close to completion. I remember the sound of Emily's voice saying, "We don't need your money," and I realize how far away that moment feels, how small it has become compared to the vastness of everything that followed. That sentence once defined me. Now it only reminds me of how I began to reclaim myself. I don't know how many years I have left, but I'm not afraid of time anymore. Age isn't a closing door, it's a softening, an expansion, a slow unraveling into truth. I've stopped counting the things I've lost and started noticing what remains. The taste of warm tea, the sound of rain against the roof, the steady beat of my own heart when the world grows still. I used to think peace was something you earned after struggle. But I see now it's what's left when the struggle no longer defines you. Tonight, before bed, I'll open the window again. The air will be cool, the scent of lilac drifting in. Somewhere a train will pass, its distant hum carrying stories of people I'll never meet, and I'll feel connected to them all. I'll whisper a small prayer, not to any god in particular, but to the universe itself. A thank you for letting me live long enough to see my own worth. And if any woman like me is listening, somewhere out there in the dark, I hope she hears it too. You are enough, even when they tell you you're too much. You are seen, even when they pretend you're invisible. And you have nothing left to prove. Then I'll close the window, turn off the light, and lie down with the comfort of knowing that everything I gave found its way to where it needed to go, and that at last, what remains is entirely mine.